All right. Hello, everyone. This is Stephanie Coleman with Kansas LEND. I'm the Autism Family Educator at the Kansas LEND program. LEND stands for Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. We are a workforce training grant that's paid for through the Maternal Child Health Bureau here at the University of Kansas Medical Center. And tonight we are providing you a family education session on sleep and learning about sleep and some other things with actually a past LEND trainee. Brittney Huntington is joining us tonight. I do want to let you know real quick, a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this. We are live on Facebook. And if your camera is on in Zoom and the slides are down, you will show up live on Facebook. If you leave your camera off, you will not show up on Facebook. So I just want to share that real quick. For those of you watching on Facebook, thank you for joining us tonight as well. Just put in any questions you may have in the comment section and I will get them asked for you. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brittney.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here tonight to talk about sleep. So first, just a little bit about me, so that way you kind of know who I am. I have been a registered nurse for the last 8 years and spent most of that time working in pediatric home health. In 2021, I left my full-time nursing career to get my doctorate of occupational therapy from KU, and I'm currently finishing up my last semester for that degree. During my time in home health, yes, very exciting. During my time in home health, I saw the impact that a lack of sleep had on the families, not only during the night, but all of their daytime activities as well. And then during occupational therapy school, we had an awesome presentation on sleep and just learned about what it looks like to address sleep through an occupational therapy lens. And feel like I kind of found my area where my nursing background and occupational therapy really overlap, and have spent my last semester of school working on sleep with pediatric families. And so also just a couple of other fun facts about me. I love coffee, being outdoors, and spending time with people. So our goals for tonight are just to understand some of the science behind sleep, identify some of the potential barriers to sleep, and then learn some strategies that promote quality sleep. As Stephanie said, feel free to pop any questions in the comments on Facebook or the chat on Zoom, and we'll get your questions answered as they come up. And then we'll also have a little bit of time at the end for some questions. So here's just a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about tonight. First, I just want to talk a little bit more about occupational therapy. You may have also heard it referred to as OT, and what it looks like to look at sleep through an occupational therapy lens. We'll talk a little bit about the science behind sleep, and then identify some potential problems and just think about some questions that we can ask to figure out maybe what problems are interfering with sleep for our child or our family. And then lastly, we'll talk about some evidence-based strategies to address the issues that we might be seeing. So what is occupational therapy? Occupational therapists help individuals participate in meaningful and necessary activities in daily life. And so sleep impacts all other areas of daily life. I like to think of sleep as the foundation to all other occupations. It can have a positive or negative impact on the rest of our occupations or the things that we want or need to do in our everyday life. So if we're looking at sleep from an occupational therapy lens, we'll look at the person and what's going on with them that might be impacting sleep, as well as a lot of environmental considerations and what's going on in the area that they're trying to sleep. And then lastly, we look at the occupation itself of sleep and what tasks are required to have successful participation in sleep. So why do we sleep? Sleep allows for restoration and repair for our brain and our body. It plays an important role in memory, consolidation, growth and development, emotional regulation, and the strength of our immune system, among many other things. It is very, very vital to our survival. But in my experience, it's often dismissed and families aren't given the support that they need to really help promote high quality sleep. Something I want to touch on is what's called a sleep debt, which is a buildup of chronic insufficient sleep. If we think about a financial debt, it has a little impact if we have a little bit of debt, but the more financial debt that builds up, it compounds and creates more havoc in our life sometimes. And so it's the same with a sleep debt. If we have a little bit of sleep, but generally we're getting really good sleep, then it might not have the same impact. But if we're consistently not getting enough sleep, it can have a big impact on our daily life. And so some of those things that we might see include daytime fussiness, cranky, fussy, or irritable behaviors, decreased impulse control, problems with memory, attention, decision making, and decreased growth and development. There are a few terms that I think are helpful to really understand what each of them mean whenever we're thinking about sleep. So sleep onset is the time of actually falling asleep. So for example, if we get into bed at 8:30, but we don't fall asleep until 9:10, 9:10 would be considered the time of sleep onset. And then sleep latency is the time between the lights going out and us falling asleep. And so in the previous example, if we go to bed at 8:30 and we wake up at 9:10, our sleep latency would be 40 minutes. Sleep associations are the behaviors that occur at the time of sleep onset. Often we're only able to go back to sleep if those same environmental things are happening. So if your child falls asleep with you in the bed and then they wake up in the middle of the night, they've learned to associate that you are there whenever they fall asleep. And so it might be difficult for them to fall asleep on their own. And we can have a lot of different associations, and some are more helpful and some are less helpful. There's not necessarily a right or wrong. It's just good to know that we have sleep associations. And then finally, sleep duration is the total amount of time that we spend sleeping. So a little more science behind sleep. There are a couple different biologic factors that impact sleep. One of them is our circadian rhythms. This is our internal body clock. It runs on a slightly longer than 24-hour cycle. And this internal body clock has an impact on our sleep-wake cycles, but it also has an impact on digestion and appetite, and then also our core body temperature. Because the circadian rhythms are slightly longer than 24 hours, it's really important that we get morning sunlight, preferably outdoors, but even just opening the blinds, turning on the lights in the house, first thing in the morning, that kind of sets our clock for the day. And then when our body perceives darkness as like the sun goes down, we dim the lights in the evening, that increases our melatonin production, which is a hormone that helps signal to us it's time to fall asleep. And so that's why it's important to kind of have a really dark sleeping space. The second biological factor in our sleep is our homeostatic sleep drive. So as we're awake, our adenosine builds up and then leads to this pressure to sleep. And usually this pressure is the greatest at night. Sometimes people call the homeostatic sleep drive the sleep pressure. And it's why it's easiest, hopefully, to fall asleep at night because it's built all day. And then in infants and young children, adenosine builds faster, which is why they often need to nap during the day, to where us as adults don't need that nap in the middle of the day. Although sometimes it's really great to have a nap in the middle of the day. So there is some science behind the quality of sleep that we get. Whenever we consider how our circadian rhythms are helping us to know if we should be awake or asleep, and how that homeostatic sleep drive or sleep pressure is impacting us, if we can time our sleep to where both of those things are high, then that will result in the highest quality of sleep. And so the amount of sleep needs are very individual, but we do kind of have some guidelines that we can go off of for how much sleep we need in a 24-hour time period. So just roughly for a 1 to 3-year-old, 12 to 14 hours. For a 3 to 5-year-old, 11 to 13 hours, 5 to 10, 10 to 12 hours, 11 to 17, 8.5 to 10 hours, and then adults is 7 to 9 hours. And for those young kids especially, it's total amount of sleep in a 24-hour time period, so it's also including if they're napping, we're not expecting them to sleep 14 hours during the night. So because there is a range, there are some things that we can think about to see if our sleep needs are being met or maybe we need more sleep. than what we're getting. And one of the best ways to determine those sleep needs is to consider what daytime behavior is looking like. So if it's difficult to wake your child in the morning, if they have to get up at a certain time for school and you have to go in and wake them up 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 different times, if they have trouble focusing at school or at home or at therapy, if they're falling asleep while they're sitting still. So if you're riding in the car and they're falling asleep, or if they're watching TV and often dozing off, or if they're having trouble controlling their emotions, if something small happens that usually doesn't seem to bother them, and now all of a sudden it seems like it's just a big emotion every time something little happens, then these can all be an indication, if they're happening consistently, that maybe it's our nighttime sleep that's impacting our daytime behavior, and it can be a good indicator to know if we need more sleep than what we're getting. So there are a couple different types of sleep that we go through during the night. The first one is called non-REM sleep, or non-rapid eye movement. And this one has 3 different stages. The first stage is just whenever we're kind of dozing off to sleep. Stage 2 is what we kind of consider more of the true sleep. And then stage 3 is a deep sleep. And this is the one where, like, if you've ever woken up and feel like you maybe got ran over by a bus and it just feels so hard to get up, it might be because you were woken up whenever you were in stage 3 of your non-REM sleep cycle. And so it makes you feel pretty terrible whenever you wake up in that cycle. And then the second type of sleep that we go through is called REM sleep. And in this one, our muscles often relax a lot. And so we'll see less body movements, but our eyes move a lot more. So we have, as it says, rapid eye movement. And then our heart rate also usually increases. And REM sleep is whenever we see dreams, or whenever we might remember our dreams are probably happening in this REM sleep. And so during the night, we do cycle between REM sleep and non-REM sleep approximately 4 to 6 times. And it's really common to wake up a little bit whenever you're cycling between the 2 kinds of sleep and going into the next sleep cycle. But it becomes a problem if you're not able to fall back asleep between those cycles, which we call consolidating your sleep cycles. And so this might be whenever you see a lot of wake ups in the middle of the night, because all of us wake up in the middle of the night. We just often don't remember and are able to go right back to sleep. But for some people, they'll be awake longer in between these different sleep cycles. So I just want to touch a little bit more.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Sorry. Through all those different levels of sleeps, which one did you say, like, is the one that is the most restorative, the one that we need the most of?
The non-REM sleep. That
The
first sleep that we're
non-sleep.
getting, that deep non-REM sleep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So whenever we talked about the circadian rhythms, we touched a little bit on melatonin. It's a hormone that's naturally produced by our bodies that helps us to fall asleep, and it's triggered by darkness. So it's really important whenever we think about melatonin production to not use screens before bed, because that can suppress the melatonin production, or any other lights and that sort of thing. It is available as a dietary supplement and is widely used. And that's something that whenever we get to the interventions, that we'll talk about some, just kind of how to figure out what to pick as far as a supplement there. Melatonin helps you fall asleep, but it does not help you stay asleep, which is a common misconception about the use of melatonin. And then research does indicate that there might be some different amounts of melatonin that are produced in individuals with disabilities and different neurodevelopmental disabilities. So melatonin use is something that has been researched a lot in different populations. Last thing I want to touch on are just some medical conditions that can impact sleep. These can be an important part to the puzzle. Some medical conditions that can impact sleep are snoring or sleep apnea, reflux, seizures, restless leg syndrome, parasomnias, which includes like nightmares, night terrors, or sleepwalking, low iron levels, or any medications that might be impacting sleep. Some medications, the side effect can be that it disrupts sleep. And so we want to work with our healthcare provider whenever we're addressing sleep. If we're seeing any of these issues, we want to address the medical issues in addition to some of the different behavioral strategies that we'll talk about later to get the best results and get some good sleep. So sleep is really important, but it often gets dismissed. Sleep problems are a big problem, and 20 to 40% of children experience sleep problems, and that increases to 40 to 80% whenever we're looking at just children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. As we know, rest and sleep are really important, and so next we'll talk about some issues and things that might be happening and how we can kind of identify those. But first, I just want to say that like with all of these strategies, consistency is one of the biggest keys to success with any of the strategies. And it's really unique what works for each individual. And so it will take a lot of trial and error to figure out what works best, but figuring out what the problem is can be a good first step. So as I was saying, figuring out the problem is the first step. And in doing that, I want to encourage you to stay really curious and just ask a lot of questions. Like thinking about what might be impacting sleep just requires thinking about different things that might be going on throughout the day, and even just like what's happening over a week and all of those sorts of things. So just stay very curious. So one of the ways that we can kind of identify sleep issues is to keep a sleep log. Everything we do throughout the day impacts sleep. So if you can track your sleep, but also if you can think about what you're eating, what your child's eating, especially the things that they're eating right before bed, and then what they're playing or activities, exercise, movement, spending time outdoors, all of those sorts of things throughout the day, how they might be impacting sleep. And so one way we can do that is to track sleep over a 3-day time period. And that gives us just a good amount of data to be able to look at. And I highly encourage writing it down and keeping it in a log, because that can ensure that we have accurate information to help guide the strategies, because all of the days can just run together and it can be hard to remember what maybe happened one day that you had good sleep to be able to use those strategies to get that consistent good sleep. So some ideas for how to go about tracking that sleep. One of my favorite and the easiest is just using pen and paper, just writing down in a notebook what's going on, or even using the Notes app on your phone. A lot of us have our phones with us all the time, and so that's an easy way to just keep track of when your child's falling asleep, when they're waking up, if they're waking up during the night, putting that in there, and then just some of those things that are happening throughout the day. You can also use a sleep log. I included a picture of one here. Some people find those helpful. There's a lot available online. I also can get anybody one if they want one. And then there are a couple of apps that you can use if that's something that is of interest. I always say that the best system is the system that you will use. It does not need to be fancy, and you're a tired caregiver, so you don't need to add more stress to your life. We just want to have a little bit of data to look at, so that way we can kind of know where to start with some interventions to help with sleep. Now we get to talk about the good stuff, the stuff of how do we actually get good sleep. So sleep hygiene includes habits and routines that promote good quality sleep. And so we'll kind of talk about more of these in detail. There's kind of 3 big categories that we'll talk about, is creating and implementing a bedtime routine, and then activities or things that we can do during the day to help us get better sleep, and then also looking at the sleep environment and what that looks like and how we can get better sleep from an ideal sleep environment. So first, we'll start with the bedtime routine. A bedtime routine is just a short list of activities that are completed around the same time and in the same order each night. This set of activities really signal to the brain that it's time to go to sleep. You want to pick activities that are calming to your child, and then as you complete the routine, keep the lights low and the sounds quiet to really kind of promote that we're calming down and we're getting ready to go to bed. And then also use really simple language at night and be consistent with whatever language you choose to kind of refer your child back to. We're completing our bedtime routine so we can calm down and go to bed, and use that same phrasing each night whenever you're implementing it. And then also just consider moving the more difficult or stimulating activities to earlier in the routine. We want all the activities to be really calming, but if there are some in particular that are a little bit more stimulating, we want to put those earlier in the routine and then progressively get to more calm activities. So that way, by the time we go to bed, we're calm and ready to fall asleep. So just want to talk about a few things that are maybe not great in a bedtime routine, and then some things that some people find helpful. A bedtime routine is very unique to each individual, so just because something doesn't help one person doesn't mean it won't help another person, but these are just kind of some ideas to guide you along as you think about creating a bedtime routine. So some things to avoid, like we touched on a little bit earlier, screen or electronic use 1 to 2 hours before bed. We want to avoid any activities that excite or stimulate your child, any loud toys, bright lights, or excessive movement. All of these things can kind of elevate us and get us more excited and aroused. And that's the opposite of what our goal is whenever we're doing our bedtime routine. And then any difficult activities that might cause frustration for your child. So, like, for example, brushing your teeth is commonly included in a bedtime routine, but if that's something that your child is really resistant to, we don't want it to be part of the bedtime routine. Maybe we brush our teeth after we go to dinner, complete a preferred activity to kind of calm us down, and then we go into the bedtime routine. So that way we're not elevated and escalated and then trying to crawl in bed and fall asleep. That doesn't really work well for any of us, and so it won't work well for our kids either. So then some ideas that we can include in the bedtime routine include brushing our teeth, putting on pajamas, a warm bath, reading a book, drawing or coloring, listening to classical music or any like calming music. Put babies or stuffed animals to bed by placing blankets over them. If this is something that your child plays with a lot, you can put blankets on them, and then they kind of know, hey, we're putting all of our toys to bed, and so I can also go to bed as well. Using massage or carrying heavy items, some kids do really well with a lot of input, and so if we can have them put away heavy toys or put away some laundry or even doing yoga, something like a downward dog can really help get the input that they need to calm their body down. So talk about a few strategies that we can use when implementing a bedtime routine. Starting a new routine can be really challenging for children, but there are a few things that we can do to help them be successful. As you're making the routine, really let your child be part of it. We really want them to buy in to the experience. And so one way we can do that is to give them choices and let them choose some activities. So maybe you have 2 or 3 different activities that you think would be calming for them. You could let them choose 2 out of the 3. So that way they feel like they have some control in the bedtime routine, and it kind of feels like something that they're doing and they really get to be part of. Or you could let them choose the order. So if you think that it doesn't really matter 2 or 3 things what order they go in, you could let them pick which order do you want to do these things. Do you want to do this first and then this? That sort of thing. And then as we're creating a bedtime routine, using a visual schedule can be really helpful. And that can look a lot of different ways. Some people just do a simple chart. You could do a chart where they get to check a box off. I have an example here where they close the flap after they've completed the activity, but kind of having a visual so that way they have really clear expectations of what to expect, but then also you can kind of point them back to it and help them feel like they have some control over it. So for example, instead of you telling them what to do, you can be like, look at your bedtime routine. What does it say is the next thing to do? And they can be more responsive to doing the task than if a parent is telling them what to do. And then one of the things that can be really helpful when implementing a new bedtime routine is doing a family meeting. And so this can just be a simple meeting where the family sits down and maybe you talk about a list of sleep rules that you want to have as a family. And it can be whatever you decide works for you. Maybe it's I go to bed at 7:30, I stay in my bedroom. When I wake up, we do XYZ. And you can just write it down on a piece of paper. And so everybody has a clear expectation of what it is that the family does whenever they sleep. And then this also is a really good time to introduce that visual schedule or the bedtime routine. You can kind of talk about it. So that way, when bedtime comes, they're not surprised or it's not as new and overwhelming. And then you can also incorporate siblings this way. So maybe you have one child that sleep is really a problem, but you can have the other sibling come to the family meeting and it can be this fun thing that the whole family is doing together to start this new thing. And then, as I've kind of said before, the biggest thing, even with the bedtime routine, is just being consistent. So make a decision about your bedtime routine that is very doable. It doesn't have to look like somebody else's. We want it to really work for your family and your situation, because being consistent will be the biggest thing in how successful the bedtime routine is. So next we have some daytime activities. And these are just activities and routines that we can do during the day that have an impact on our sleep. As I kind of talked about earlier, one of the really big things that we can do to reset our body clock and those circadian rhythms every day is getting morning sunlight. If we can get outdoors, that would definitely be the preference. But if it's cold or you have other barriers to getting outside, even just opening the blinds and turning on the lights can really help. Exercise, movement, or activities can improve sleep, and we want to make it fun. So if your child doesn't like exercise or that doesn't sound like something they want to do, don't call it exercise. Come up with a game or some activities. The goal is to just move our bodies more. Even as adults, the more we move our bodies, the better we're going to sleep at night. We just want to make sure that we don't do this too close to bedtime because that can kind of wind us up and make it harder to go to bed at night. If we limit caffeine intake, we don't want to drink caffeine past 12 p.m. so that way it doesn't interfere with our sleep. And then if we do have a child that's napping, we want to wake them up by 4 o'clock so that way the sleep isn't so late in the day that they then can't fall asleep at night. And then, as I've already said before, limiting that screen time before bed will help to increase the melatonin production that's happening at night. And then lastly, one that's kind of hard but is really beneficial is waking up within an hour of the same time each day, even on the weekends. It can be really easy to want to just sleep more on the weekends, but research does show that waking up consistently, even on the weekends, leads to more consistent sleep, a longer duration, and some higher quality sleep. So a hard one, but a beneficial one. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the sleep environment. Going back to that melatonin production, that's a huge thing that influences our sleep. And so we want to create a really dark sleeping environment. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using room darkening shades. But sometimes people will use foil or cardboard or even black trash bags and tape it up to the windows to make a dark space. And it can be a good option if maybe you don't want to invest in room darkening shades. You could try one of those options that you already have on hand for a few days and see if it makes a difference to know if it's worth investing in room darkening shades for your family. And then another thing to think about is a lot of electronics or different devices that we plug in might have a little light on them. Like I have a phone charger that has a green light on it. And so even those small little lights can have an impact on our sleep. And so you can put black electrical tape or even use duct tape, put it over that so that way that light isn't impacting sleep. And then if you feel like your child does better with a night light, you just want to use a pink or orange toned one rather than a blue or bright light, because that blue bright light is if you think about the sun, middle of the day sun that's really bright, that's really what's going to suppress the melatonin. But as the sun sets and we have the warmer toned light, that's what kind of signals to our bodies we want more melatonin production. And so if we go towards that pink or orange toned nightlight, that'll be a little bit better. Some other environmental factors outside of the sleep environment when thinking about the darkness of the room is the room temperature. Cool rooms provide the best sleep. We want it to be between 65 and 72 degrees to be the ideal sleeping environment. And then we also want to think about external noises, whether that's outside of the room that a child's sleeping in, or that's outside the house or the apartment that we're living in. Those external noises can really impact sleep. And so one thing we can do is look into sound machines, and we'll talk a little bit more about sound machines next and kind of what kinds of noises they have and different ways to use those. And then some children may be sensitive to smells. Some might be alerting, some might be calming, but thinking about if there's any smells that are happening that may be keeping your child awake. Lavender can be really calming, but for some people, having too strong of scents can be really overwhelming and they don't like it. And then lastly, thinking about objects that are in the sleeping space. Sometimes kids can have stuffed animals or toys that are in their bed, and it's great, but then they can end up with too many animals in their bed and it becomes hard to sleep. And so it's just something to think about, like, are they able to get good sleep with 12 stuffed animals in their bed, or maybe should we limit it to one or two to get a little better sleep? So I just want to talk a little bit more about sound machines. They can be a really good method to help sensitive sleepers from waking up toward the external noise that's happening during the night. For safety, it's best to place the sound machine 7 feet away or as far. Some rooms aren't that big, but just as far away from the child as you can. You don't want to place it directly by them. And then also trying to limit the decibels to 50 decibels or less. There are some apps that you can get that will test the decibels. And that's just to make sure that we're not causing any hearing damage from a continually loud noise all night long while we're sleeping. And then one thing to keep in mind with a sound machine is whatever sound is on whenever we're falling asleep, we want to keep it on all night, because kind of like we were talking about at the beginning with those sleep associations, if it's on whenever we fall asleep and we wake up in the middle of the night and it's no longer on, it can be hard to fall asleep without that sound there. Different noises are better for different people. Some people really love white noise and other people can't stand the sound of it. Some sound machines, or if you use an app to find different sounds, have pink or brown noise, which are a little bit lower toned and have been shown to be good for sleep. And then, or just anything that's repetitive without words. So that way they're not hearing words that are maybe then making them think about different things, but just having that low repetitive sound. Another option outside of like a sound machine or an app is to use a fan. I know a lot of people sleep really well with a fan on. Not only like that cool air, but also you're getting the noise of the fan. So that can be a good option. And with sound machines, it's a lot of trial and error. Like sometimes they help a lot, and then some kids, they actually make their sleep worse. So just have to try it and see what works best. Just want to talk a little bit about sensory preferences and how that can impact our sleep. So sensory processing is how we take in the world around us. Sensations such as sight, sound, movement, and touch impact each of us differently. Some individuals are more sensitive to sounds, and other people don't notice the sensations around them. There are a lot of environmental factors that are within our sleeping environment and can impact people more or less depending on their sensory processing preferences. So some different things that we can think about as we're considering maybe what sensory processing patterns are impacting sleep include thinking about the type of sheets or blankets that an individual prefers. Some people like really heavy blankets and other people want a sheet while they sleep. The texture of a blanket might be a problem. And so that's something to think about if we're using a blanket that maybe someone doesn't like the feeling of. And then there's also compression sheets for people that like a lot of deep input. For older kids, they're not recommended for kids under 4, but for kids older than that, the compression sheets can be a good way to get some input if a child needs that overnight. And then we want to think about what they're wearing. So what pajamas are they wearing? What like texture are they? What weight are they? Are there tags in them that are bothering them and they feel itchy during the night? And that's keeping them up. So if there's any clothing that they don't like during the day, they're probably not going to like it at night either. And so trying to do the same clothing that is tolerable during the day would be the best material and texture for the night. And then kind of like we touched on with the environmental and bedtime routine, just thinking about what activities are calming and alerting for your child. You might have one child that is really calmed by something and another that same thing is really alerting. One example is a massage. Some people are really calmed down by a massage. That's very relaxing. And then other people, it's very alerting and they don't like the feeling of getting a massage. And so we really want to tune into each individual needs whenever we're kind of thinking about different things to implement in the sleeping environment. And then the same goes for lights and sounds. Some people can sleep with all the lights on, and other people, even the tiniest amount of light is really bothersome. And so we want to consider how light and sound might be impacting them. And then lastly, just thinking about different deep pressure or heavy work. We call that like proprioceptive input. And so some kids that are heavy seekers do really well getting some of this before bed. And so things like yoga, doing the laundry, like any type of animal walks where they're really getting a lot of good input can help meet their sensory needs before they get in bed and help them be able to lay in bed easily or easier. So sometimes one of the problems at bedtime is staying in bed after the bedtime routine. I like to call these curtain calls. If your kid is coming out all the time after you have said goodnight and they're supposed to be in bed for the night. And so one way that we can help with this is to implement a bedtime pass. And so what this is just a card. It can be anything, a coupon you make, a piece of paper that works for your family. And they have a bedtime pass. And if they need to get out of bed, if they want to get out of bed, they have something they need, they can give their bedtime pass to a caregiver, and then they can get whatever they need. And you can decide what works for your family, how many bedtime passes you want your child to have. Some people like to do a like reward system with their bedtime pass. So if they have a bedtime pass still in the morning that they didn't use because they stayed in their room, then they can turn it in for a sticker or for a special date with you or whatever it is that you like to use. But if you don't like to use rewards, you can definitely use the bedtime pass without the reward attached to it as well. And then another strategy for staying in the bedroom is an okay to wake clock. And so these are clocks that change color to indicate when it's time to be awake. Red is often used to indicate bedtime, and green is often used to indicate that it's okay to wake. The visual aid can be really good because sometimes the problem is a kid might wake up at 5:30 in the morning and has no idea that it's 5:30 in the morning. And so they just think, oh, my body's awake. It's time to wake up for the day. So having this clock that they can see, oh, my clock's not green yet. It must not be time to get up, can be a really helpful strategy to get them to stay in their bedroom until the time that you've decided. When using an okay to wake clock, one of the things that we want to do is we want kids to be successful with it. So if they're currently waking up at 6 and you would really like them to stay in their room until 7, we can set the clock for 6:10. So that way they just have a little bit of time that they have to stay in their room past whenever they're waking up. And then maybe in a few days, we can change it to 6:20 to 6:30 and so on until we get to that time that we've decided. So that way we're not going from, okay, now you need to stay in your bed an entire hour longer than what you're used to. And so they can be successful with it. And then another option is you can have a basket of toys that you use, maybe some books or stuffed animals or whatever quiet toys you decide. And these are just toys that they can play with while they're in the room. And so maybe they don't have to stay in their bed, but you just want them to stay in their room until 7 o'clock. And so these are the toys that they can play with while they're in there. Generally, any kids above 2 is whenever we start using these, they're able to cognitively understand what the light means, and red and green are just a good, it kind of goes with the stop light. Red means stop, green means go, but a lot of the clocks have different colors if that's something that you want to be able to change. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit more about melatonin and using it as a supplement. So research does show that the use of melatonin in conjunction with other sleep hygiene interventions can have a positive impact on sleep. It does help with falling asleep, but not staying asleep. However, there are slow release melatonins that do help a little bit more with staying asleep because the melatonin is released throughout the night. And so that can kind of help a little bit more with the staying asleep. There is not conclusive research on what the recommended dose of melatonin is. They do recommend you start with a low dose and then increase as needed. And most kids don't need more than 3 to 6. But always talk to your healthcare provider before starting a new supplement. One, just to get their opinion and what they recommend for a dose, since there isn't a consistent dose recommendation. But then also to make sure that melatonin isn't going to interact with any medications that they're on, or that it would just be a good fit for them. It is non-habit forming, and research does show that it's safe to use for short term. There is still emerging research on how safe it is for long-term use and if it has any impact on puberty. There is one study that looked at over a 2-year time frame and didn't see any problems with puberty and melatonin use, but there isn't conclusive evidence on the long-term use, and so it's generally recommended as a short-term aid in addition to other sleep hygiene and other interventions that you're doing to kind of get back on track with sleep. It can also be really helpful if you're going through like a time change or like going to a different time zone or traveling and your body just isn't used to producing melatonin at the time that you're going to sleep. Melatonin can be really helpful. Melatonin supplements can be really helpful then. And so just a little bit more on melatonin. It is a dietary supplement, and so it's not monitored by the FDA. And so it is something that we really want to be aware of whenever we're selecting a melatonin. We want to look for one. There's a few different verifications that you can look for. A USP, NSF, or CLCO are all organizations that will test dietary supplements, or some supplements have their own like third-party testing that's an outside company that can test it to make sure that what the label says it contains is actually in the product. And so that's one way that we can kind of ensure that we're getting what we think we're getting without it being regulated by the FDA. And then another thing to think about is some melatonin supplements will come with other ingredients in it and not just melatonin. And so it's always a good idea to look at the ingredient list to make sure that you're not getting anything else that you don't want to be taking. When we use melatonin, we want to take it 30 to 90 minutes prior to bed, and that's just so that way we take it and it reaches its peak and we have the highest amount of melatonin at the time that we're ready to fall asleep. It does come in multiple forms, liquids, gummies, and capsules, so you can use whichever one you think your child would take the best. And then lastly, just some common side effects include morning drowsiness, headaches, and increased nighttime bedwetting. And then just as a reminder again, always check with your healthcare provider before starting any new supplements to make sure that it will be a good fit for them. And then last, as we kind of wrap up, just some things that I want to share on implementing new routines and making changes. As you've heard a lot, staying consistent with any strategy that you choose to implement is going to be the biggest indicator for success. And change can be really hard, both for you as a parent to implement and stay consistent with, but it can also be really overwhelming to your child. So I would suggest selecting 1 or 2 ideas to start with at a time, rather than just saying, we're going to completely redo everything all at once. Just pick 1 or 2 and see how they work. And if they work good and then you want to add something to it, you can do that. And then also, as you're implementing something new, there can be a lot of resistance at first. So just because you try something for 1 or 2 days and it doesn't seem to be helping, I would say give it a few days, even up to a week, to really see if it's going to help as you overcome that resistance. However, if you try something and it is just absolutely terrible and you're like, there's no way we can do this for a week, you don't have to do something for a week. But I just encourage you to really give something new a chance to really work and overcome that initial resistance to doing something new. And then lastly, if your child has a healthcare provider or therapist, share some ideas with them or ask them, hey, I am trying to figure out what things would be good to include in a bedtime routine for my child. Have you ever done any activities with them that you feel like are calming, or we're thinking about trying this strategy? What do you think? Just to get more input, because it really does take a community to get good quality sleep. That's all I have for tonight. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. My contact information is here. If anybody has questions later, needs any resources, product recommendations, or just any general follow-up, I would be more than happy to do that.
Great. Thank you, Brittney. I am not seeing any questions out on Facebook. So if you have them, feel free to go ahead and put them in the comment section and I will get them asked. As I say that, I want to make sure I look again. Okay. This has been,
if
oh, go
anybody
ahead.
wants to the references, there you can scan that QR code and all the references are there.
Great. This has been filled great information and you have been so thorough and complete. I don't even have any questions and I always have questions. I just wish I had known a lot of this stuff 25 years ago when my son was going through all these problems. He never stayed in bed. He never stayed in his room. That was one of the big things. And I love that green and red clock idea. I'm wondering if I can get my dog to understand that. But no, this has been some really great information tonight. Does anybody, we're going to give it a few more moments to see if anybody has any questions. A few people on Facebook, so I want to give you some time to put a question in if you have one. I'm not seeing anything, so any in our chat. All right, well, we'll wrap this up then. So, Brittney, thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise with us. This has been some really great information. And as I was listening, I think about my own sleep patterns and how much sleep I'm getting and where I'm not getting enough and how can I do something different. But I know for a fact that I am like this at night as well and am on my phone way too long into the evening. So that probably has a lot to do with it. So I am going to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great evening. We really appreciate it.